Meloni versus the globalists, a battle for national sovereignty. In an era where European leadership is increasingly centralized under the influence of unelected bureaucrats, Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni stands as a rare beacon of national sovereignty. Alongside Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, she is one of the few leaders in the European Union who prioritizes the will of her people over the dictates of Brussels. In stark contrast, Ursula von der Leyen's leadership represents a clear and present danger to both Europe and the wider world, as she spearheads a globalist agenda that seeks to strip nations of their autonomy. Meloni's leadership echoes that of Silvio Berlusconi, a figure who, despite his controversies, championed Italy's independence from European overreach. Today, as von der Leyen and her allies, much like Britain's Keir Starmer, whose connections to financial elites, including the Rothschilds, are well documented, tighten their grip on European governance, Meloni's fight for national self-determination becomes ever more critical. Meloni, a continuation of Berlusconi's fight for Italy. Silvio Berlusconi was a defiant leader who sought to preserve Italy's economic and political independence, resisting Brussels' attempts to impose fiscal policies that disadvantaged his nation. He championed Italian industry, sought closer ties with Russia, and rejected the EU's rigid economic constraints. Meloni, though coming from a different ideological background, continues this legacy by pushing back against EU-imposed migration policies, energy regulations, and economic restrictions that threaten Italy's sovereignty. Meloni's leadership embodies a form of economic and cultural nationalism that directly challenges the European Commission's centralization of power. Under her leadership, Italy has taken a stronger stance against illegal migration, prioritizing border security and national interests over the EU's open border ideology. This is a direct rebuke of von der Leyen's approach, which promotes mass migration policies that have sparked social and economic instability across Europe. Ursula von der Leyen, the face of globalist control. Ursula von der Leyen represents the epitome of the unelected globalist elite, whose policies align more with the interests of multinational corporations and financial institutions than with the citizens of Europe. Her tenure has been marked by a top-down, authoritarian style of governance, exemplified by her handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, where she pushed for stringent EU-wide lockdown measures and vaccine mandates without national consultation. Von der Leyen's approach to energy policy is another example of her allegiance to globalist interests. Her aggressive push for green policies has disproportionately harmed European economies, particularly nations like Italy, which rely on traditional energy sources. By enforcing extreme environmental regulations and aligning with the World Economic Forum's (WEF) agenda, she is actively dismantling European industries under the guise of sustainability. The role of WEF and Klaus Schwab, another arm of globalist control. The World Economic Forum (WEF), led by Klaus Schwab, is another powerful entity driving the globalist agenda. Like von der Leyen, Schwab operates at the behest of the same financial elites who seek to centralize power and weaken national governments. The WEF's Great Reset initiative advocates for a restructuring of the global economy, shifting power away from sovereign nations and toward a technocratic elite. Schwab, much like George Soros and Emmanuel Macron, represents the interests of the globalist oligarchy, using financial influence to push policies that erode national autonomy. Macron's leadership in France follows a similar pattern, prioritizing multinational corporate interests over the well-being of the French people. By aligning with the WEF's objectives, these figures contribute to a systematic dismantling of national sovereignty across Europe and beyond. Keir Starmer, the British counterpart to von der Leyen. Keir Starmer, much like von der Leyen, operates as a figurehead for financial elites, particularly those connected to the Rothschild banking dynasty. His leadership in the UK follows a familiar pattern, an abandonment of national interests in favor of supranational governance. Starmer has aligned himself with pro-EU factions, hinting at a potential reversal of Brexit policies that could see the UK gradually reintegrated into the European system of control. His stance on digital currencies, surveillance, and corporate-driven economic policies mirrors the direction in which von der Leyen is steering the EU. Both Starmer and von der Leyen embody the new wave of Western leaders who prioritize globalist objectives over national sovereignty. ensuring that power remains concentrated in the hands of a few elite figures. Their leadership threatens the very concept of democracy by circumventing the will of the people through bureaucratic maneuvers and media manipulation. Meloni and Orbán, the last defenders of European sovereignty. Against this tide of centralization and globalist control, Meloni and Orbán stand as the last major European leaders actively resisting Brussels' overreach. Both have prioritized national identity, economic self-reliance, and immigration policies that reflect the will of their citizens rather than the demands of the EU elite. Orbán, for instance, has successfully resisted EU pressure to accept migrant quotas and has maintained strong bilateral relationships outside the Western economic sphere, particularly with Russia and China. Similarly, Meloni has rejected the forced redistribution of migrants, called for renegotiations on EU energy policies, and sought to reassert Italy's right to independent decision-making. The future of Europe, a choice between sovereignty and subjugation. As the European Union faces mounting crises, economic instability, unchecked migration, and energy uncertainty, the divide between leaders like Meloni and globalist figures like von der Leyen and Starmer will only widen. The coming years will determine whether Europe remains a collection of sovereign nations or succumbs entirely to supranational governance dictated by unelected elites. Meloni's leadership represents a return to national identity and self-governance, much like Trump's battle against the entrenched political establishment in the United States. Whether Italy can withstand the pressures from Brussels and its globalist allies remains to be seen, but one thing is clear: the fight for Europe's future is far from over.